Husbands and wives that got divorced after 20 years of marriage, what made you decide to change your mind after all that time? There's a guy in my town that everyone knows about because he owns this huge ass mansion in a middle class neighborhood. Apparently he was married to a woman for a long time, but she left him calling him a loser because his business hadn't taken off yet. After she left him, his business finally took off. He sells medical equipment to hospitals, and he became fuck you levels of rich in a few years. The reason he built the mansion in that neighborhood was because that is where she lives, so she has to drive by the mansion on her way to work every day. He tried to kill me, which I feel is impolite. My parents got divorced after 22 years of marriage. They were never in love and didn't even like each other. They had me and then my sister a few years later and wanted to stay together for the kids 12 years. After I was born they had my brother and that kept the cycle going. I wish I could say they are happy now, but they still like to cause trouble for each other. We are due with our first child soon, and they are gonna have to figure out how to be grandparents together. Thankfully I'm 1500 miles from them, so it won't be a headache often. At age 8 my dad threatened to leave my mom because he was threatened by her brother. My uncle didn't do anything wrong, but my dad didn't like another man in his kids' lives because he had fears of abandonment, and getting replaced still has those fears. So he gave my mom an ultimatum: it's your brother or me, you gotta choose. My mom, fearing to hold together a family, chose my dad. My uncle was broken about it because my mom was forced to shut him due to reasons he didn't even understand. Fast forward 6 years and my older brother, now in college, develops an outside view of the family life and began to understand the ashlery of my dad. So my brother called my dad and gave him his full mind on what he thinks of my dad and how he's done petty things out of fear. My dad flipped and blamed my mom for that because he thought she was putting words in his mouth. Things were tense for a bit between my dad, father, and mother until my dad decided to move out officially because he felt not welcome in the family. That was 5 years ago, and he's been living separately since then, but my parents are still legally married due to joint owning a lot of assets. A year ago, however, I found out that my dad had been dating a 25-year-old for over a year. He's 60. The scary thing was that my mom knew the whole time, but she didn't tell us because she feared how it would make us view our dad. My mom is still very broken up about the fact that it was my dad that left her, despite him having toxic and manipulative behavior toward her, me, and my brothers for the latter part of their 25-year marriage. Grandparents got divorced after 30+ years of marriage. Met in the early 1950s in a really small town. Both about 19 or 20, and got married 2 years later. I think that was kind of just what you did back then. They had a pretty traditional marriage with 7 children. I think my grandmother grew up and became more independent, and my grandpa really just wanted a traditional stay-at-home wife. When the kids were old enough, she got a job as a secretary. She had lots of friends and a social circle. My grandfather pretty much just worked and came home and watched TV. In his 50s, he slipped and broke his back and couldn't work anymore. He really just stopped doing much of anything after that. Sat on the couch all day chain smoking cigars and watching TV. He was also becoming more and more of a hoarder as he got older. I think even before this point they were already more or less roommates. Eventually, Grandma had just had it with him. She filed for divorce. He had a hard time accepting it. He was supposed to be staying with one of his adult kids, while his other kids were working on purchasing a small house for him in the neighborhood where a few of his kids and grandkids lived. He kept breaking back into the house he had lived in with my grandma. She confronted him during one of these break-ins and he killed her. I think he was probably depressed through much of his life, but because he grew up with that small town 1950s mentality he was just taught to bury that down. I'm not sure they ever loved each other, but they had a marriage of convenience that worked okay for some time. He was pretty detached from raising the kids, and when he no longer felt useful he just unraveled. It's too bad, because he lived over 10 more years in prison. He could have had a relationship with his grandkids, but one impulsive act crushed that. I always felt robbed of having a relationship with either of those grandparents. Obligatory, not me, my parents. My dad filed for divorce after 25 years of marriage. My mom was shell-shocked. My dad was absolutely miserable, but the signs of a failed marriage were always present. My dad is very emotional and is quick to anger. He never really handled failure very effectively and would be mad instead of constructive. My mom very family oriented and was adamant that we never move farther than 40 miles from Chicago. Hell, when I was going away to college, she begged to my dad to force me to go to a school closer to home. In a way, I think my dad resented my mom for never letting him travel or get away from Chicago. It also doesn't help that I'm fairly certain my mom became undiagnosed depressed once her mom died. All she would do was do her bare minimum at her job, a school bus driver, come home and sleep, finish her route for the day, cook a hamburger, help a meal for the family, and then play Angry Birds on her iPad. It's really weird seeing your parents divorce in your 20s. You're adult enough to speak candidly and neither of them likes what you have to say about them during or after the fact. The silver lining out of it is my sisters and I know how not to behave in a relationship. I worked at a law firm that only practiced family law, divorces, child custody, wills and estates, etc. At one time we had like 8 clients getting divorced after 20 plus years of marriage and they were all high-ranking military men whose wives came out of the closet after all their kids had grown up and moved out of the house and the guys were getting ready to retire. I thought it was so weird, but I guess for whatever reason the women thought that their duties to their husbands and families were coming to an end and they wanted to live for themselves. I guess I know why they couldn't come out 30 years ago. It was a different time, but I was curious why they were all attracted to military guys. I assume maybe cause it meant their husbands would be away 4 years at a time during their service. Not myself, but my parents. They were married for 22 years when they separated, 24 years by the time the divorce was final. From the perspective of a child in the situation, there was no way that they were happy people together. There was hardly ever a quiet moment in the house because of my father's temper, but my mother knew how to serve it back too. However, the final straw was more of a chain of events. My father had a very rigid view of the family. Man works, woman stays home, cares for the home and children. When I was in high school my father got injured at work and needed surgery. He worked a physically demanding job and would be out for 6 months. My mother, knowing that we were already falling behind on vehicle and house payments, decided to find part-time employment. She worked while the kids were in school. It was still important to her to see her kids get on the bus and be there when they got home. My father immediately believed that she was cheating on him. He installed a tracker and tape recorder in her car. He showed up at her workplace and caused a scene multiple times. He questioned her coworkers. He spent most of time at the house drinking. This was not an equal partnership, and it really never was. You should have seen how hurt he acted when my mom finally asked for a divorce. But he rebounded real quick. All he had to do was tell some woman on Plenty of Fish his sob story, and he moved right into her house. He spent a couple of years treating her and her children horribly before she kicked him out. Only took him a couple of weeks in a hotel to find *KNOTHER* woman to let him move in. My husband began surreptitiously going to strip clubs. He stole about $200 a week from various accounts and a business I owned to fund these activities. He lost his job because he went there so often at lunch and would just stay. We had young kids, and so I stayed after he got some therapy. He was never honest with the therapist. About a year ago I learned he was doing it again. Plus texting strippers. My youngest kid graduates high school this year. I've done what's best for everyone else for 20 years now. This September was 21 years. I don't anticipate having a 22nd anniversary. It's really scary to think of being alone. I don't hate him. I feel sorry for him. I know he will feel very sad and lonely when I'm gone. But being near him feels like having my soul ripped from my body every day. My parents split up after nearly 30 years. My dad was an asshole my entire life, so when they finally divorced, when I was 18, there was no surprise. He'd been cheating for years and I think he was the one who finally asked for it. I think my mom stayed because she couldn't afford to start over. She spent her life putting my dad through school and wasn't educated herself. She had no family or anyone who could help her either. There was definitely some confidence issues on her part too. Therapy changed my mind. After more than a decade of being miserable, I finally got help. When I was able to really talk about my marriage was when I realized that I needed to get the fuck out. At the end of the day, I stayed in a shitty marriage because the thought of being alone scared me. Through therapy I was clued into how many wonderfully supportive friends and family members I had if I just reached out to them. I wasn't going to be in a relationship anymore, but I wasn't alone neither. Parents divorced after 25 years when my mom had what we thought at the time was a midlife crisis. She told my dad, by draining $3K from the joint checking account to fund her divorce lawyer. 6 years later they were officially divorced, since she blew through that money on different lawyers that kept firing her as a client. We later ruled out midlife crisis when her behavior started to become more odd, erratic, and paranoid. She was in her early 50s when this behavior started. Now we, myself and my sister-in-law with psychology experience, think she has late onset bipolar, and I say think, since we can't get her officially diagnosed, since she believes nothing is wrong with her. She lives in New York, and it is super hard to commit someone there, unless they are a danger to themselves or other people. She's not dangerous, just can't hold down a job, and lives in her car due to her own insubordinate sporadic paranoid behavior, but blames everyone else. No, she's not a narcissist, just mentally ill, since she was never like this when we were growing up. She was very selfless and caring when she was younger. Edit. Hi Redditors, thanks for sharing all your stories. I'm sorry if I couldn't respond to everyone. Ironically, I was just fielding my mom's texts and calls about her most recent job firing this morning on my birthday. I hope everyone who shared a story has an easier time going forward, since that's what I hope this new year brings us as a family. We were together for 20 years, married for 15. We started as high school sweethearts, but we eventually realized that we weren't the same people we were when we fell in love. We also realized that that wasn't going to change. We decided that the best way for everyone to be happy for the rest of our lives was to end it on peaceful terms before we were both 70 and resentful of each other for trapping each other in an unhappy marriage for 40+ years.